we look at the textures of the 19th century, we often see them through the bold, heavy patterns designed by William Morris. We see the creeping acanthus leaves, the intertwined marigolds, and the dense medieval idealism that sought to push back against the smoke of industrial England. Yet, behind these tapestries, within the very walls where they were conceived, lies a human landscape that was far more delicate. Fractures hidden beneath beautiful surfaces. Hello and welcome to the Sunday Echo with me, Cate Field. On this channel I release quiet wanderings on Sundays and Wednesdays, exploring art and artists, writers and their fascinating stories. I am delighted that you are here. Today we are stepping into two houses that bookend a marriage. Red House in Bexleyheath and Kelmscott Manor in the remote water meadows of Oxfordshire. Through the timber and stone of these places we find the quiet, often obscured presence of Jane Morris, navigating a world that viewed women as symbols, even as she wove her own reality into the fabric of history. Let's start with the meeting at the theatre. The collision of their two worlds occurred in the autumn of 1857 in an Oxford that was still largely medieval in its architecture and its social boundaries. William Morris, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Edward Burne-Jones were young men of comfortable means, steeped in the romantic medievalism of the university where they attended. And they went to a performance in Oxford given by the touring Drury Lane Theatre Company. And in the audience that evening sat Jane Burden, 17 years old, the daughter of a stableman living in the cramped, impoverished alleyways of Holywell Street. Her mother, Anne, was a domestic servant and she was recorded as being illiterate. To the young pre-Raphaelites, who were currently covering the walls of the Oxford Union with frescoes of Arthurian legends, Jane's appearance was a revelation. It was Rossetti who first singled her out, struck by a face that seemed to have stepped straight from the murals that they were struggling to invent. She didn't appear for the meeting that he arranged, and it took a chance encounter with Burne-Jones to persuade her back into their orbit. Once she returned, she began sitting for Rossetti as Queen Guinevere, and soon after for Morris himself, in whom something quieter and more permanent had taken root. Jane's entry into this artistic circle required a swift and intense education, shall we say. Upon her engagement to Morris, she was tutored in the accomplishments expected of a middle-class lady: classical music, Italian, French, and the complex rules of Victorian etiquette. She absorbed these skills with a remarkable quiet intelligence, transforming her speech and her bearing so thoroughly that contemporaries noticed that she could pass for a member of the nobility. Yet this education was a form of displacement, separating her from her working class origins while placing her on an aesthetic pedestal where she was expected to remain still and be admired. Let's now move on to the Red House, the Palace of Art. In 1860, Red House rose out of an orchard in Kent like a fairy tale made of solid red brick. It was built as a collaboration between William Morris and the architect Philip Webb, designed to be a total work of art where a new life could begin. The atmosphere of Red House during those early years was one of intense, youthful idealism. Friends like Rossetti and Burne-Jones spent weekends painting the walls, designing stained glass, and embroidering the hangings. And at the centre of this vivid world was Jane, now married to William, navigating the expectations of her new social standing. In the Victorian imagination, a woman of Jane's background was expected to be remade by marriage, to become a quiet vessel for middle-class propriety. For the Pre-Raphaelites, however, she was seen as something else, the living embodiment of an ancient, tragic beauty. Her tall stature, her dark, wavy hair, and her heavy lidded eyes became the physical template for an entire artistic movement. At Red House, Jane was learning the complex language of embroidery, transforming her role from passive model to an active artisan. Her long, precise stitches filled the large daisy hangings that warmed the brick walls. Yet, there was an underlying weight to this paradise. The house was designed as a medieval dream, a stage, if you like, where William could play the chivalric knight and Jane the quiet queen. The reality of cold winters, the isolation from London, and the shifting affections within their close circle began to settle into the mortar. And so we arrive at Kelmscott Manor, a landscape of compromise. By 1871, the dream had shifted. Red House was abandoned, and the Morrises, along with Rossetti, took a joint tenancy of Kelmscott Manor, a grey limestone house sitting in the damp meadows near the upper Thames. Kelmscott felt ancient, its roots stretching back to the 16th century. It possessed a melancholic, quiet beauty that deeply affected everyone who lived there. The house became a landscape of profound emotional compromise. William Morris, intensely aware of the deep romantic bond between Jane and Rossetti, would often leave for months at a time, travelling to Iceland to translate sagas, leaving his wife and his closest friend in the quiet isolation of the Oxfordshire countryside. Away from the canvases, Jane's daily life at Kelmscott held its own quiet demands. Her elder daughter Jenny had begun to suffer from epilepsy, a condition that, in this period, was widely met with institutional isolation and shame. Jane and William chose otherwise, and it was Jane who carried the greater share of Jenny's daily care, alongside the running of the household and her own embroidery commissions. A labour that has left far less trace in the record than the paintings did, though it asked no less of her. In the paintings produced during this period, Jane appears repeatedly as a figure trapped in myth. Rossetti painted her as Proserpine, the goddess bound to the underworld for half of every year, holding a pomegranate in a dim, shadowed room. Looking closely at these canvases, it's easy to see Jane merely as an object of tragic obsession, a beautiful face onto which men projected their own longings and their own anxieties about women and womanhood. The Victorian era loved to idolise women as either the pure angel in the house or the tragic, untouchable muse. In both roles, the actual voice of the woman is ironed out, replaced by a beautiful stillness. The narrative of Jane Morris has begun to shift recently, moving away from the melancholic muse of the gallery walls towards the quiet, resilient woman who managed the complex realities of Kelmscott. William Morris's impact remains highly visible. His designs for wallpaper and chintz are still manufactured today, and his political essays on socialism and anti-industrialism continue to influence. They influence environmental thought, for example, and his Kelmscott press books are celebrated as pinnacles of typography. For decades, the history books treated him as a solitary genius, an energetic force who remade English design single-handedly. Jane's legacy, by contrast, was long obscured by the very paintings that made her famous, because she was viewed through the lens of Rossetti's obsession and his obsessive portraits. She was remembered as a silent, sickly ghost drifting through the dark rooms. The turning point came only in 2012 with the publication of her collected letters, where the previous century had known her chiefly as a set of brushstrokes, if you like. Her own words revealed something else entirely: warmth, dry humour, and a reticence that had too easily been mistaken for emptiness. Alongside the letters, scholars researching the archives of Kelmscott Manor, many carefully preserved by her daughters, Jenny and May, uncovered the deep extent of her practical contribution. Jane was an extraordinary needlewoman whose technical skill executed many of the grandest textile designs of Morris & Co. Her hands stabilised the shifting experimental dyes that William created. Her judgment guided the weight and the direction of the silk threads that gave the tapestries their life. Furthermore, she was the manager of the domestic economy that allowed the Morris firm to flourish, and she was the conservator of Kelmscott itself, purchasing the house after William's death to ensure its survival for future generations. Late in her life, reflecting on the path that had carried her from stableman's cottage in Holywell Street to the mistress of Kelmscott, Jane wrote simply that, given the choice again, she supposed she would do the same. It's a modest sentence, and perhaps the most honest one she left behind. By reading her letters alongside her embroidery, a different figure emerges from the historical texture. A woman who used her intelligence and her needle to carve out a space of independence within a society that sought to turn her into a beautiful, silent monument. When we look at Kelmscott Manor today, with its grey stones and its garden full of old-fashioned roses, we are looking at a monument to survival. The tapestries on the walls are a shared legacy, containing the breath, the labour, and the endurance of Jane Morris. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next time when I wander about more fascinating people. Take care. Bye-bye.